Welcome to Studio again. Today, let's dive into deep realities. January 2026 did not arrive with spectacle. There were no leaks timed for maximum outrage, no emergency summits convened under flashing cameras, no public state. What follows clarity is not silence in the emotional sense, but order. Institutions, once they decide, reorganize themselves around the decision until it becomes invisible. That is what has happened here. The British monarchy has not announced a new posture, it has embodied one. And embodiment, unlike proclamation, does not invite debate, it simply exists. Over time it becomes normal. And normality, in politics, is far more powerful than persuasion. History rarely records the moment when an institution decides to stop caring. It records only the effects of that decision once they have hardened into precedent. That is why this moment, though understated, carries more weight than any public rebuke ever could. Public rebuttals invite counterarguments, statements demand responses, engagement sustains relevance. Silence, by contrast, closes the circuit, it communicates not uncertainty but completion. The British monarchy has chosen to define itself without reference to those who chose to leave it. That choice is not vindictive, it is architectural. The crown does not need unanimity, but it does require alignment. When alignment cannot be restored through accommodation, it is restored through separation. This is not exile in the historical sense. No one has been cast out, stripped publicly, or named an enemy. Instead, the institution has recalibrated its perimeter. Perimeters matter more than personalities. They determine what is protected, what is supported, and what is ignored. Once the perimeter shifts, those outside it may still speak, still act, still narrate their version of events, but they do so without institutional consequence. Their words may circulate, but they no longer reverberate. This is why the silence matters more than any statement ever could. It denies the illusion that proximity to the crown can exist without submission to its constraints. For years, that illusion persisted. It was sustained by ambiguity, by delayed decisions, by the hope that compromise would stabilize what compromise had already destabilized. But ambiguity, left unmanaged, does not soften conflict. It compounds it. Prince William's approach reflects an understanding that monarchies are not sustained by emotional accessibility, they are sustained by limits. The modern era tempts institutions to humanize themselves endlessly, to explain, to confess, to empathize publicly. But transparency without boundaries does not strengthen authority, it diffuses it. Vulnerability, once converted into content, loses its moral force and becomes another commodity in the attention economy. The crown cannot survive as content. It cannot compete in a marketplace that rewards outrage, intimacy, and perpetual disclosure. Its power lies precisely in what it withholds: reaction, improvisation, emotional escalation. In choosing silence, the monarchy has chosen its native language. Critics will argue that this posture hardens the institution, rendering it colder, less human, perhaps even cruel. But monarchies do not exist to be relatable. They exist to be stable. Stability is not warmth, it is predictability. It is the assurance that the system will behave tomorrow as it behaved yesterday, regardless of personal turbulence within it. When stability is threatened by internal contradiction, the contradiction must be resolved. If it is not resolved deliberately, it will be resolved externally, by courts, by parliaments, by public erosion. History is unforgiving on this point. Institutions that refuse to define their limits eventually have those limits defined for them, often violently, often irreversibly. Seen in that context, restraint is not heartlessness. It is survival. The Sussex story will continue. Personal narratives always do. They evolve, adapt, and find new platforms. They generate attention cycles and cultural debates. But they will do so without institutional amplification, without constitutional weight, and without the implied promise of return. That promise, once carefully preserved, never formally withdrawn, has now expired through disuse. This is how institutions end chapters, not with confrontation but with redundancy. No denunciations. No reconciliations staged for cameras, just a recalibrated system moving forward with fewer variables, fewer risks, and firmer lines. In political terms, this is not punishment, it is governance. There is also a generational lesson embedded in this moment. Institutions that endure are those that recognize when accommodation becomes appeasement. For years, concessions were made in the hope that goodwill would produce stability. Instead, each concession expanded the field of dispute. Boundaries soften not into peace, but into perpetual negotiation. The palace appears to have concluded that negotiation itself had become the destabilizing force. Clarity, though painful, restores equilibrium. For Prince Harry, that clarity arrives too late to salvage relevance within the system he rejected. His critique depended on proximity. Proximity has now been withdrawn. Without it, the narrative shifts. What once felt insurgent now feels iterative. What once carried institutional risk now carries none. For Meghan Markle, the realization is structural rather than emotional. Influence detached from enduring authority is temporary by design. Celebrity without institutional backing is loud but fleeting. It commands moments, not eras. The monarchy, by contrast, trades in time. It does not need to win the argument of the moment. It only needs to remain standing when the moment passes. That is the fundamental asymmetry critics often miss. Individuals seek resolution. Institutions seek endurance. Individuals speak to be heard. Institutions wait to be obeyed. When those logics collide, only one can prevail. The British monarchy has chosen resolution over romance, structure over sentiment. It has accepted the cost of being misunderstood in the present to preserve coherence in the future. Whether history judges this moment as necessary or merely inevitable remains an open question. But inevitability itself carries a verdict. It suggests that no other outcome could have endured. What remains after the noise fades is not drama but precedent. And precedent is the true currency of institutions that expect to outlive generations. By formally disengaging from the Sussexes, the monarchy has drawn a line that future monarchs will find difficult, perhaps impossible, to cross back over. It has clarified where family sentiment ends and constitutional necessity begins. This is why the silence matters. It is not avoidance, it is design. The institution has recentered itself around a narrower, more disciplined conception of duty, representation, continuity, restraint, fewer voices, fewer exceptions, fewer contradictions. In doing so, it has stripped away the illusion that the crown can be selectively invoked without being fully born. The gates have not been closed in anger, they have been secured in policy. And that, more than any speech or statement, is the clearest signal of all. The monarchy has decided it no longer needs to explain itself to those who chose to leave it behind. Ents crafted to inflame or reassure, what it delivered instead was something far more destabilizing to those who misunderstood the nature of power: clarity. Not the emotional clarity of confession or reconciliation, but the colder, sharper clarity of institutional resolution. What ended was not a marriage, not a familial bond, not even a public feud. What ended was an illusion, carefully maintained for years, that the modern British monarchy could indefinitely reconcile internal fracture with external continuity, that it could absorb contradiction without consequence, and that it could remain simultaneously bound by blood and governed by exception. For nearly a decade, the public had been encouraged to believe that the rupture between the Prince of Wales and his younger brother remained provisional, temporary, reparative. Palace language leaned heavily on patience, on healing, on the idea that silence was not absence but care, that distance was not finality but discretion. Each non-comment was interpreted as restraint, each lack of escalation framed as maturity. The narrative implied that reconciliation was not only possible but inevitable, that time itself would do the work institutions could not publicly perform. But institutions do not heal. They do not wait for emotional readiness, they do not prioritize catharsis. Institutions evaluate risk, manage incentives, and enforce boundaries. They endure not by sentiment but by structure. And over time, the structure began to strain under the weight of an arrangement that asked it to be two contradictory things at once: inclusive and impermeable, forgiving and authoritative, flexible without appearing weak. Prince William's recent actions, muted, procedural, and notably devoid of emotion, signal that the strain reached its limit. There was no dramatic declaration, no rupture staged for public consumption, no denunciation issued in anger. Instead, what occurred was something far more consequential than a feud, an institutional decoupling. The monarchy did not reject the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. It simply stopped accounting for them. This distinction is critical. Rejection implies engagement. It invites response. It sustains relevance. Decoupling does none of these things. It reclassifies. It redraws the system so that what once required management no longer exists within the framework at all. The Sussexes are no longer treated as a problem to be solved, a relationship to be repaired, or a variable to be balanced. They have been categorized as external, outside the system. Beyond its responsibility, its protections, and its ambiguities, modern monarchies do not survive on affection, they survive on coherence. Their authority is derived from continuity, restraint, and the disciplined separation of personal grievance from public duty. For several years, that separation eroded. Titles remained while functions disappeared. Status was invoked even as discipline was rejected. Proximity was claimed without submission to constraint. The result was a contradiction that could not endure. A monarchy cannot be half ceremonial and half optional. It cannot be both symbolic anchor and personal brand extension without hollowing out the meaning of both. What Prince William appears to have concluded, correctly from an institutional perspective, is that ambiguity had become corrosive. Ambiguity can be useful when it buys time. It becomes dangerous when it substitutes for decision. The so-called half-in, half-out arrangement was not merely unsustainable, it actively undermined the logic of the crown. Each exception created precedent, each concession invited renegotiation, each silence intended to lower the temperature instead raised the stakes. This was not a decision born of anger. It carries none of the marks of impulse. It is administrative in nature, bureaucratic, almost dull in its execution, links quietly removed, references allowed to expire. Responsibilities not reassigned, invitations not extended, silence deployed not as punishment but as policy. In this sense, the most consequential weapon has not been exposure, rebuttal, or confrontation. It has been indifference. Indifference is often misunderstood as weakness. In institutional terms, it is strength. It signals that the system no longer recognizes the stimulus as internal, that it no longer needs to respond. Engagement implies relevance. Silence denies oxygen, and oxygen in modern media ecosystems is everything. For Prince Harry, this moment represents a painful reckoning. His public narrative cast him as a moral corrective, a truth-teller challenging a rigid, unfeeling institution. The power of that critique derived from its origin. It mattered because it came from within, from proximity, from access, from the implied risk of speaking against one's own system. But once the speaker exits the system entirely, the critique transforms. It becomes commentary rather than testimony. Moral authority depends not on volume but on position. Access, not anger, gives relevance its force. When access is withdrawn, grievance loses its leverage. What once destabilized becomes background noise. What once commanded attention becomes content competing in a crowded marketplace. This is where institutions diverge sharply from families. Families negotiate endlessly. Institutions decide once. And when they decide, they rarely reverse course, not because they are cruel, but because reversal erodes legitimacy. The monarchy has learned, often painfully, that it cannot function as a supporting character in someone else's narrative arc. Vulnerability converted into content ceases to be vulnerability at all. It becomes transaction. For Meghan Markle, the consequences are less emotional and more structural. Elite social capital does not operate on nostalgia, it operates on future access. Prestige is not sentimental, it is transactional. It flows toward power, not memory. When the palace signals quietly, unmistakably, that a connection has no future utility, the market responds. Hollywood responds, finance responds, global influence circles recalibrate. These ecosystems are not loyal, they are efficient. Remove proximity to enduring authority and attention migrates elsewhere. Not out of malice but logic. What is most striking about this moment is not its severity but its restraint. There has been no public condemnation, no exile declared, no doors theatrically slammed. The monarchy has simply ceased organizing itself around the Sussex question at all, and in institutional terms, that is final. Prince William's calculation reflects a broader truth about governance in the modern age. Systems do not survive by absorbing every shock. They survive by deciding which shocks they will no longer absorb. The monarchy has chosen coherence over catharsis, continuity over conversation. The family story may continue elsewhere, in memoirs, interviews, documentaries, and digital platforms, but the state has moved on. This is not a story about villains or victims. It is about the irreconcilable difference between personal narrative and institutional logic. Families negotiate feelings, institutions enforce boundaries. And when those boundaries are crossed repeatedly, clarity becomes not an option but a necessity. The gates have not been slammed shut, they have been locked quietly from the inside. What follows clarity is not silence in the emotional sense, but order. Institutions, once they decide, reorganize themselves around the decision until it becomes invisible. That is what has happened here. The British monarchy has not announced a new posture, it has embodied one. And embodiment, unlike proclamation, does not invite debate, it simply exists. Over time, it becomes normal, and normality in politics is far more powerful than persuasion. History rarely records the moment when an institution decides to stop caring. It records only the effects of that decision once they have hardened into precedent. That is why this moment, though understated, carries more weight than any public rebuke ever could. Public rebuttals invite counterarguments, statements demand responses, engagement sustains relevance. Silence, by contrast, closes the circuit. It communicates not uncertainty but completion. More updates will be coming up soon. Stay alert.